there's more than just free beer to the concept of open source.
So I guess this is a big consideration for companies before entering an open source project, to really look at what am I committed to do.
Totally.
You're listening to IoT and IP Explained with Claudia Tapia, where experts discuss the latest in technology and intellectual property.
My dear colleague, Jimmy Alberg, often starts his lecture on open source with a simple question. Who among you uses open source? Usually only about half the audience raises their hands. Then he follows up. Who uses Google search? Please raise your hand. Who owns an Android phone? What about an iPhone? And he keeps going until eventually every single person in the room has their hand up. The reality is open source is everywhere. It powers the devices we use, the software we rely on, and plays a crucial role in the Internet of Things. This is why I invited Carlos Muñoz, co-founder and COO of Alinia, to join me today. We're going to talk about why open source matters, some of the biggest misconceptions around it, how companies make money from it, what different open source licenses mean, what to watch out for, and much more. Carlos, welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Hello, Claudia. Pleasure to be here.
Let's start with the basics. What is open source and why is it so important?
Sure. So open source is source code publicly available, enabling users to inspect, modify, distribute, or even redistribute the source code under specific licensing conditions that probably we will later on talk about. But regardless of these conditions, you will always be able to have these kind of four prerogatives I just mentioned. It is super important because actually nowadays, specifically in sectors such as IoT or even nowadays artificial intelligence, it is considered the backbone of all these emerging technologies such as connectivity protocols, but also, for instance, if we shift to artificial intelligence, these large language models powering now new generative AI applications. So again, it is just the backbone of new digital trends emerging nowadays.
And it's something we use in our everyday, as I was saying before in the introduction. And many people think that they don't know about open source, that they don't use it, but they do. Every day we use open source.
I totally, fully agree. So if you think about, for instance, operating systems, so one of the main kind of platforms empowering any computer or any device, you can think about Linux, right? And the Linux operating system is the clear epitome of a successful open source project that you don't think about, but probably it is being run in a lot of different devices.
It is. What are the biggest misconceptions about open source?
Super nice question. So I think the first one probably is because or due to the fact that it is open, right? And it is publicly accessible to everyone. Maybe the quality is not as good as a commercial project. So quality could be one of them, but then you realize that some open source projects are super, super good quality. That's one. The other one probably is that open source is kind of free or accessible for free. And then you realize, first of all, it is not as easy to implement. And then it is not just about freely accessing or using the code, but also it demands a lot of expertise to then develop a commercial version of it, right? So there's more than just free, as in free beer, to the concept of open source.
Yes, I had to think about this message that when something is for free, it means that it's your data, which is the product, or you are the product.
Yeah, that's a great example.
But they are also the ways to monetize all this investment that has gone through this open source research behind any of those projects. Could you share some ways that these companies monetize open source?
Yeah, sure. So you have to think about open source as the main core technology that is going to be publicly released, right? So you release this technology normally for different reasons. Either you want to gain legitimacy in the market, right, as a really high quality software developer, or even as a high quality AI model developer, right? So want to gain legitimacy, and then by legitimacy, you want to gain also market attraction. So basically, you want users to use your innovation, in this case, your publicly accessible open source based innovation. And once they use it, probably they will need related services. But these services, for instance, added warranties when it comes to the quality of the product, or premium versions on top of the initial released product, all this goes on top, and you of course charge for it, right? This is not for free, let's say it like this.
So, for example, we have this service which is with the basics for free, and then you have the premium you have to pay, and that's where you get maybe the support, the cool features, and maybe the extra.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I saw the ways to do that is by having a license, which basically you force everyone to give everything they have for free, even what is not related to open source. Can you tell a bit about that?
Yeah, so I think if we take a step backwards, and as I was previously mentioning when I defined the term open source, it is going always to be based on specific licensing conditions. Why? Because at the end of the day, the existence of this license departs from the existence of intellectual property rights in the artifact, in this case, source code, you are publicly releasing, right? So due to the existence of, for instance, copyright or patents, you license the rights to use these intellectual property rights for the source code, for instance, you publicly released. So therefore, we have licenses, but we have different types of licenses, right? So on the one hand, we have a family of licenses called permissive open source licenses, such as, for instance, Apache 2.0, or MIT, or BSD. We can later on deep dive on those. And then we have restrictive open source licenses, such as GPL. The main difference between those is that GPL, for instance, is going to require you, whenever you are distributing again either the source code or a new version of the source code, to do it under the same licensing conditions. So someone could argue that it kind of hinders the commercial strategy or commercial distribution, because you are forced to basically license again for free your incremental innovation. And then finally, we have the permissive. Let's get back again to the permissive family of licenses. Basically, you can do almost whatever you want with it, as far as you abide by some specific terms, such as the legal notice or authorship attribution of the source code.
Mm-hmm. So I guess this is a big consideration for companies before entering an open source project, to really look at what am I committing to do.
Totally. I think it is a super big consideration for companies, and it depends on the company and on the specific market you are at, right? So normally when suddenly in a traditional or more legacy industry, such as, I don't know, insurance or even pharma, some engineers are using open source software, and then they tell to the compliance team they already use this open source software. The compliance team always is going to check, first of all, the license. And they have probably a list of red flagged licenses, such as GPL, and they have a list of do's and don'ts for these licenses. And same goes with permissive licenses. And normally permissive licenses, such as Apache or BSD, are the green light, and they're becoming the main kind of also commercial standard for using open source projects.
Mm-hmm. In the Internet of Things, could you explain what is kind of the relationship that you see between open source and Internet of Things? How do they interact? What is your forecast regarding open source and IoT?
Yeah, great question. So I think I start with the premise that Internet of Things is kind of a high umbrella term. Within this umbrella term, you have different verticals or also different market niches, right? So within IoT, you can speak about 5G or wireless technologies, but at the same time, data collecting devices, or even we can go all the way through generative AI nowadays, powering basically or interpreting this data collection and transposing it into intelligible natural language that you and I can understand, right? Which is just great, and it's at the same time super crazy. We are already there. Now, all these different market niches covered under the IoT concept rely on open source, right? So for instance, if you go to AI or these kind of large language models, some of them, like the best ones, are open source already under licenses such as Apache 2.0 or BSD. So as I told you, permissive licenses, right? But we can go all the way down to the 5G or telecoms sphere, where we start to have some wireless protocols already open sourced, either by private consortia, so different companies joining together to create this new technology openly available for everyone, right? Or just some specific companies wanting to develop a protocol and just releasing it publicly available for everyone. So again, depending on the market niche within IoT, you may have a lot of different open source projects. And if you want, we can deep dive into some of those.
You know, when I was listening to you, I was thinking about this experience I have of being in meetings where open source came out. And then sometimes I have the impression there's kind of two camps, like open source is the solution for everything and open source is terrible. I am a believer that open source can be great in some scenarios and in others can be terrible. So could you maybe explain let's start with the positive. What would be open source the right approach?
So I can speak about when open source can be or can bring benefits, right? About the right or wrong approach, I think it's far more difficult to explain. I don't have kind of the right approach to open source. It's going to depend in a lot of different scenarios. But the positive things, I think, to open source within, again, in this case, the IoT space might be basically because, first of all, you realize the technology you are developing or you are considering to develop is so relevant that you need to develop it collectively and share it with the others to basically be able to improve this technology and just take it to the next level, because you know it's going to be just a transversal technology empowering every single device. And I think this is also kind of the concept of, in a way, standardization, and how in some very specific aspects, open source can work well within this context of standardization. But there might be other cases where you don't really want to open source something because you are really working on a fantastic and great product. And this product is based on proprietary technology that you invested huge amounts of money to develop, right? And the quality of your product and the main differentiators of your product rely on your intellectual property rights. And you fought hard for this. And this is your main way also to commercialize the technology to your clients. And at the same time, you have gained this legitimacy in the market vis-a-vis your clients when it comes to great innovation, and great innovation through a different way of instrumentalizing your intellectual property rights, which is not via an open source license. It simply is via proprietary licenses. And both concepts can coexist. It's totally fine to have this kind of proprietary commercial approach to some of your products, right? Because probably you give more certainty to also your clients, but at the same time, you might feel sometimes that you really need to open source some of your projects.
Makes absolutely sense. And there are also ways to collaborate where you don't use open source, like what we see, for example, in standardization with the FRAND regime, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. I think, as you said, there are several factors to consider before you say yes or no to an open source project. You mentioned the licenses, you mentioned the revenues, expected revenues, your own role within the project. Is there any other important factor that people should consider when analyzing whether to join or not an open source project?
Yeah, so I think there are several. Joining an open source project might seem great, and indeed it is. So my previous experience at Hugging Face, which is basically Hugging Face, is just a huge open source AI platform, and everything there, it's open source, right? Every single AI component, it's open source, from the data set to the machine learning models or some very specific source code, right? So this is great. But once you are into it and you try to develop this kind of collective approach to develop technology, in this case, open source, you realize at the same time how hard it can be, right? Because think about it, you are trying to create a new community for it to collectively develop or even just maintain an existing software stack, right? So you have to agree among each other just to realize or to take decisions with regards how do we develop this technology or how do we even maintain this technology. And this is a huge investment of both time, but also financial investment or human expertise related investment. So that's just one specific case, which might happen, for instance, in the AI community. I mean, at Hugging Face, I can tell you just a very specific example. There was a project called Big Code, and basically we developed a machine learning model, these kind of large language models, enabling users to generate code, right? So source code automatically. And we had hundreds of users within the project, and the project took 8 months. It is not something that you do in a couple of weeks or 1 week, and it took a lot also of financial resources, right? So again, I think it is great to have these projects, but from a practical or operational perspective, you really have to think twice about joining and committing to it and the investment required.
So I hear this is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but rather something to assess individually, case by case.
Totally. I think from a commercial perspective, definitely. If we go more to the research side, or if you are a PhD candidate or a researcher or even an intern in a great company and you are just doing your first research projects, of course, open source is great, and just go for it and don't think about it because, you have all the time. Now, if you're a company, I think that's a different game.
Indeed, it is. Back to the Internet of Things. I was wondering whether there is a need to create open source licenses to tailor them to maybe specific IoT situations?
Nice question. I think that's a I would say it's a very difficult question. So I can tell you about one scenario where I see there could be a need, which is basically standardization of some of the connectivity protocols, right, that can be used within IoT, right, to connect, for instance, devices. And within 5G, you have very specific technical specifications, such as network functions virtualization, which basically mean creating this kind of communication protocols enabling to virtualize functions that traditionally were embedded into hardware, such as a firewall or encryption, for instance, or a router, are nowadays progressively, they are being softwareized, right? and kept into virtual instances. This is just an example, right? So there, within this kind of connectivity protocol context and standardization, you can see potentially the need of specific licenses, which might not be open source and might not be fully proprietary, but maybe kind of hybrid for very specific projects within standardization, right? So for instance, you are drafting a technical specification within a standardization organization, but at the same time, you want to have a technical implementation. So let's say a practical example, right? A practical reality checkpoint of what this technical specification would look like. But at the same time, you really don't want to release for free or to give for free your intellectual property rights. So you can basically tailor a specific license, which would be a license for testing purposes within this very specific context. Again, it is not a fully open source license, but it is something very specific for a very specific IoT context, I would say.
Have you made the proposal to have such a license in this scenario?
I have made a few kind of small proposals in the PhD that I'm about to defend. Yes.
Good luck with that. I think congratulations, by the way, you're almost, almost there. I think that you raised an important point, which is the need to find a balance in certain situations when we have seen also with the world of artificial intelligence, where we need to have a certain flexibility when suddenly technology evolves, but at the same time, we need to make sure the innovation is maintained and the incentives also to share are maintained. So having maybe tailored solutions and having everyone in the room collaborating might come to that. So let's see what happens. I find it more critical, the situations where people join based on a certain regime and certain conditions, and then there are proposals to take it and then implement other conditions, because then I think it's a kind of misleading. But when from the beginning, everybody is clear about what is the regime and they come up with something which addresses concerns from both sides, that's an opportunity to create something new and tailored to specific situations. So let's see what happens with those proposals.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I think back to the example of standardization, I think having, first of all, clear IPR policies, and within these IPR policies dictating some kind of access or licensing regimes for different things, such as, for instance, grants or fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms, but at the same time, probably coupled with a just copyright-specific license, even for testing purposes for a very specific thing, already upfront, I think it should be the way to go, definitely.
Do you foresee scenarios in the Internet of Things space where open source and other IPR licensing models coexist? And if so, how will it look like?
Yeah, so I think probably this kind of IPR licensing regimes coexistence is the main general rule nowadays, almost in every company, right? So by default, some companies will tend to do or to develop proprietary technologies, right? And other companies will go full in with open source. But even when you go full in with open source in, again, the broad IoT space, you have to charge for what you do, right? So you cannot give always everything for free. And there are going to be some services or even some specific premium solutions of your platform that are licensed or commercialized via proprietary terms or more commercial terms instead of an open source license. So first of all, coexistence is the way to go. I think open source or permissive open source licenses such as, again, Apache 2.0 or BSD are basically fantastic licenses to build on top a commercial business model, and more specifically in the IoT and in verticals such as AI or even, connectivity devices.
Now that you're talking about this coexistence, I wonder, how do you see the role of open source evolving in the next decade?
That's a great question. I would say, in my experience with AI, open source has become just, as I was saying at the beginning, the backbone of the new generative AI, trend. So for sure, it's going to gain even more importance and exponential use of these very specific releases, such as, again, large language models. I can give you an example, which is DeepSeek, right? So this large language model developed by a Chinese research lab or research startup, it's open source, right? And it has just hit the entire world and again trigger this kind of debate between open and proprietary technologies, right? When at the same time they are both very, complementary, just to speak. So again, I think it is going to gain more importance. And another specific example, not from a market perspective, but probably from a regulatory perspective, is in this case the EU AI Act, where you realize at the end the regulator gave or stipulated a specific open source safe harbor or exemptions, right, for it. So you see how relevant it is becoming, at least in this kind of very specific market or vertical within the IoT space.
Well, thanks so much for sharing. And before you leave, I'd like to ask you to share a lesson learned in your professional life.
Yeah, okay. So I would say the simpler, the better. It's something that I've learned for years, especially when I was doing my PhD. I used to just write just huge paragraphs, like 5 or 7 lines sentences, and probably you were one of these people that was giving me this nice feedback, but also other colleagues from the Max Planck Institute or even mentors, right? And at the end, I realized that it is true that the first thing and the most important thing when you are communicating, and if you want to be a great communicator, is really starting very simple, very concise, just for everyone to understand. And they can always come back to with more specific questions, and you can deep dive into those, right? By being simple, it doesn't mean you are not an expert in something, right? Because you're not using just complicated words. Is that you probably master the topic and everyone understands the message you're trying to convey.
That's such a great lesson learned. And I had to think about the beginning when I started to communicate in simple terms, that I had this concern that people might perceive me as not wise enough for not using fancy words. But I had to remind myself that my goal was for everybody to understand my messages, and that I could always add footnotes and add references that shows that the content has been well researched, and give away this ego part and this fear of not being perceived as knowledgeable about the topic, and focus on what really my goal was in the presentations or in the papers I write.
Yeah, I fully agree with you.
Carlos, thank you so much for joining us to this podcast. We learned a lot about open source licenses, the future of open source, the possibilities to tailor some licenses, what is going to come. We still don't know, but with all this information, I think we have a good overview of open source and how it will coexist with the Internet of Things. Thanks so much. Also, thank you to the audience for joining us. As always, comments are welcome. In LinkedIn, you can find me under Dr. Claudia Tapia. And with that, I would say goodbye to everyone. Goodbye, Carlos.
Thank you so much for the invite, Claudia, again. Ciao.
Ciao.